we've dedicated $1 trillion to a think tank that's going to answer these questions by next Tuesday, and we're going to announce them. And it's going to be hard, but we're going to know, we're going to have a North Star for all these questions. And we don't seem to know anything. Like it seems, is this, this is what you have a federal government for in many respects, isn't it? To sort of like assess all of these different like variations of how it's hitting around the country. Like one of the things is we were talking about, why does it hit in some countries and not others? And I know that your most recent piece was trying to sort of like anticipate, it was talking about the models and the sort of the failures and the difficulties of modeling this. But it seems to me that we should by now at least have some type of algorithm set up where we know what the the RO, I guess is what the term.
Yeah, since it's a British term, they say R naught.
R naught, and we should know what the R naught is in every state, right? And we should be able to plug that into an algorithm that says, here's the density in that state. Here's other demographic factors, and so we have a notion that like, this state, it's highly communicable. In that state, it's not. And then measure it from that and see what, but there's doesn't seem to be any type of like, and maybe it's happening, we just don't hear about it because they're not obligated to come out and do a YouTube show every day and make a pronouncement. But is that going on?
Well, first of all, I would just say, like, the response of the federal government has been abominable, like, throughout this process. At first, they dismissed it as a threat. They used it as a pretext for a travel ban that wasn't even effective in keeping people out of China because American citizens who have been in China were allowed to travel. They did nothing to ramp up production of ventilators when we thought they were necessary, or personal protective equipment, which we knew would be necessary, and there's been a kind of catastrophic shortage because many of the recent infections have come within hospitals, passed around from healthcare workers because they're not protected in the way that they need to. And above all, they absolutely failed to organize or coordinate anything like a comprehensive testing regime, which would be necessary to slow the disease and also allow us to move around in the world with some degree of freedom, even despite the disease sort of being still out there, which I think it will be for quite a long time. On top of all that, there's been this really strange spate of stories where governors of a variety of states all across the country have been complaining that orders for medical equipment and PPE that they have placed and paid for have shown up and then been seized by FEMA to be sort of shoveled away to a federal stockpile, which is being dispersed according to, well, we don't really know exactly how that equipment and that PPE is being dispersed, but it seems to be part of an operation run by Jared Kushner, which is a sort of a parallel coronavirus task force operating entirely separately from the standard federal disease hierarchy. And at that level too, there's an enormous amount of confusion of who's in charge and who's making decisions. Is it more important when we hear Dr. Fauci say something on TV or Dr. Birx say something on TV, or is it more important when we hear Jared Kushner saying something on TV? And this is just a total evacuation of federal leadership on the part of the president. And it's really striking to me, actually, as someone who's watched Trump over the last few years. I'm curious if you feel the same. I've always worried, I think a lot of people on the left have worried, that Trump is such a would-be authoritarian that faced with an opportunity to seize authoritarian power and enabled by a government, eager to give those kinds of powers to a president in, say, the case of wartime, that he would make himself into a kind of a dictator if he had the chance. This pandemic functionally offers him that opportunity, and instead, he's run in the opposite direction and signaled to the whole country that much more than his own desire to be an authoritarian is his wish to avoid all responsibility for anything.
Right.
He would rather like shuffle the responsibility off onto governors and mayors than even he could be operating a huge surveillance state right now. The Americans would basically buy into it. He has effectively, through, or I wouldn't say it's him, but the American public has, essentially shut themselves into little bunkers and is not going outside. This is a crazy, crazy political moment that we're living in. And Trump, rather than, approaching it as an authoritarian opportunity, just wants other people to have to sort of shoulder the burden. For all of those reasons, I think the federal government's response has been catastrophic. And I think when you look at the shape of the curves in America versus almost all of our peer countries, it's horrifying. Just about everybody else they're still going to be living with this disease. There's still going to be infections and still deaths in all parts of Europe, in parts of Asia, in Australia, New Zealand. You can't beat this entirely because the world has never been exposed to it before. But they've reduced the spread so dramatically that it is now responsible for them to talk about quote unquote reopening. In the U.S., we've flattened the curve, but we haven't reduced it at all. So we're now talking about opening up again and introducing many more opportunities for the disease to transfer from one person to another, when we haven't even brought the caseload down meaningfully from what would have seemed a month or two ago a horrifying peak of deaths and new cases. But on top of all that, as awful as I think the American federal response has been, I also look around the world and think there's been a lot of disarray and confusion. Nobody's really known exactly what to do here. Different governments have responded in different ways. Almost none of them, with the possible exception of a couple of Asian nations who were keeping a really close eye on China at the beginning. Almost no nation in the world got the response right at first. Even those that have done really well, typically had a kind of a terrifying spike followed by a proper aggressive response. And when you look at the international institutions and organizations that are theoretically designed to help us coordinate this kind of action, the UN and the WHO, they've been totally absent too. They haven't done nearly the kind of leadership and guidance that you would have hoped to see from them, nor has the CDC in the US, which is meant to be a kind of an independent scientific body and world leader. And as to what explains that, I think it's an open question which we're going to be adjudicating for the next few years. I think it's, when you look at the American side of it, it's easy to say that the Trump administration, following on decades of Republican pressure, has really emptied out the federal bureaucracy of a lot of its power and its personnel, and especially in those areas like disease control that are, staffed primarily by scientific experts who they regard with some kind of, cultural disdain. It's also possible that the failures of the WHO and the UN have something to do with the evacuation of American leadership in those areas too. That in cases like this in the past, the American president and the American government was really leading an international effort aided by those organizations, and those organizations are unable to really lead on their own. But it still is distressing that for a month or 6 weeks after the obvious outbreak of this disease in China, the WHO was still giving misleading information and advice about how to handle it. And the UN has done, still to this point, practically speaking, nothing to coordinate global response at a time when you'd want those kinds of institutions doing much, much more. So in the end, I think it may prove to be, a bigger failure than the American failure, a bigger failure than the failure of Donald Trump. He and the American government he leads may show us just how extreme our lack of responsibility and, ill preparedness, how extreme that can get. But it's not, to me, of a category different than what happened in the UK, right, or what happened in France or what happened in Spain. And so on top of which, we don't really know. It's possible that those countries are affected by like a different strain, or that there's something about their population that protects them that we don't yet appreciate. So we're still in this sort of early phase where everybody looks bad, even though the U.S. looks worse than everybody else.
There's a lot there I want to respond to. So forgive me if we sort of go backwards here a little bit, but and I imagine in terms of like, I am 4 or 5 years from now, 3 years from now, there's going to be at least some papers written about what happened to these organizations in the absence of U.S. leadership. I mean, I was just reading something the other day where it's like, the CDC used to be the first place that everyone would call across the world about this, and now they just realize like it's a black hole for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And it may turn out that some of the jingoistic rhetoric about America, leadership in the world in some areas was far more important than I think maybe some of us may have assumed. But let me.
On top of that, I think I mentioned at the beginning that the way that this crisis has opened up some new political possibilities. One of them is really, I think people are realizing how vital the bureaucracy and institutions really are.
Of course.
And maybe considerably more appetite for restoring their strength and credibility, rather than the last few decades when even democratic administrations have been sort of playing a status quo game just to preserve the cuts that had been put into place by the previous Republican administration.
Right. I mean, the idea, one would hope, but I mean, I see no evidence of it in terms of Washington, D.C. right now. One would hope that this would, spur a broader realization that, like, hey, our job is to reinvest in the country, in the infrastructure, in the human and the physical infrastructure, and develop. Like we should be a constantly moving forward machine, regardless of the market for this, right? Like the problem was that we just had no market for pandemics, apparently, for long enough that it was sufficient to maintain our production facilities, if you will, in terms of providing responses. But I want to go back. The supply line story, because I know you wrote about this. There seems to me to be two sort of like parallel stories here. One is that the federal government was using its air bridge to get supplies, to secure and procure supplies from around the world. They would bring them back and they would deliver them not to the States, but to like 5 or 6 medical distributors. I think McKesson was one of them. I think they do that with McKesson is one of those medical companies that also sort of is a middleman with drugs as well, I believe. And then these medical supply companies were able to sort of essentially open up an auction, and whoever had the most money got them, as opposed to sort of like based upon need, and the government using the DPA to say, hey, you can take 4% off the top and that's it. And you need to sell them because we procured them for you to, these states and preferably in this order, let's say. And then there seems to be this other sort of parallel story, and I imagine at one point they might meet, of when the states decided to go out on their own and bring this stuff in, that the federal government was, like you say, confiscating them, and then they were going into this sort of Jared Kushner black hole. I mean, do you have any sense of like where these two stories meet? And the question that I have not seen reported out is, when we procured these PPE or whatever it was around the world, did taxpayers pay for that? And did McKesson and those types of places, did they have to pay the government back? Or was it just that we underwrote it and McKesson ended up like saying, okay, we got, double cost on this. We now pay the place you procured it on a 60-day, whatever payoff timeline, and we make our money. Like, how did that work?
I think we don't yet know most of those details. We're in that stage of the horror movie where we're just seeing like the monster, like small parts of the monster. We haven't seen the whole ugly picture. I mean, we do know that everywhere in America, the cost of all of this stuff has skyrocketed because all of the states and all of the hospital systems are effectively bidding against each other for equipment that is in short supply. In some cases, they're paying 10 or 20 times what they would have paid for, say, a surgical mask as recently as 3 months ago. And given that, you would want a federal intervention. You would want a kind of organized, an organized system to take control of this marketplace and distribute the equipment to the places that needed it most, regardless of who had the money to pay for it. that is really the kind of response that you would not just hope for, you would sort of expect in a time of crisis like this. But what seems to be happening is, almost the opposite, which is that the federal government is using its muscle to prevent any independent actor from going outside this system, and instead making sure that those auctions are the only